In this video, I'd like to talk about fear, specifically the acronym F.E.A.R, false expectations appearing real. Once again, false expectations appearing real. Ran out of space on my whiteboard here. False expectations appearing real. I see a lot of people, especially my clients and the individuals that I advise, quite often make poor decisions because of fear. And that makes sense because, well, fear is a very powerful motivating factor. But if you break fear down into false expectations appearing real, we see multiple choices and missed opportunities where these stories, and we're going to be talking about these fear-based stories, hold people back from the success and the fulfillment they're looking for. They make poor decisions and also miss out, as we said, on that success and that fulfillment because they get stuck. And that's a really tough place to be. So first, I'd like to talk a little bit about my own story about experiences with fear. I learned a long time ago that I had stories in my head that had been programmed since childhood because of experiences I've had, traumatic experiences, developmental trauma that were like tethers, and they were holding me back from moving into the future, and they were almost manipulating me to make very poor decisions. It was like in my past, I would experience something happen that would be scary, and then a tether would be attached to me. And when I would try to move forward in life, this tether would tighten up and snap me back, kind of like a bungee cord. But instead of falling, think of it like a reverse bungee where you're trying to launch yourself into the atmosphere and reach new levels of success and height that I hadn't gone before, but then I would get snapped back down to earth. And over again, that experience would cause more stories or that story to compound, and my problems would just get worse and worse. And it took me quite some time with executive coaching, understanding how my brain worked, going through a lot of steps for healing and forgiving other people and working through my bitterness. And that seed or that root or that anchor of fear to get to the point where I could achieve new levels of success. So I'm going to break this down in terms of what happens. And this is going to take a little bit of extra time to explain, but here's how this works. So when you have a fear response, your body goes into a reaction of stress, and your body is trying to figure out, what do I do to get back to homeostasis? And this is where the poor decisions come into play. And you might have heard me break this down before. What happens when you have fear, you go into freeze, in this order: freeze, flight, fight, and some call this fawn. I like to use the word conform. Now, here's what happens. If that fear is unfounded, it is based on a story of false expectations appearing real, you will make poor decisions and you will freeze, not take the opportunity or get gun shy and get to a point where maybe you're just completely frozen and you're immobilized. You can go into flight mode, which is to run away, completely run away and avoid the situation. Procrastination is a self-soothing mechanism here, where we're under stress. So we procrastinate because we're running away, we're trying to avoid something, or we fight the wrong battles. This is a big one because I've been stuck in this before where I'm fighting the wrong battles. I'm wasting energy fighting stuff against demons or illusions or even my own creations in my mind that I didn't need to. And all it ends up doing is hurting other people because I'm just flailing around and other people getting kind of caught in that crossfire. Not a good sign. This doesn't lead to productivity or results at all. Or we end up fawning or conforming. And this one's a big one for me. With enough fear that induces that stress, we will actually fawn and conform inappropriately with people, develop codependent relationships because we're afraid of losing them, or how they feel about us has a major impact about how we feel about ourselves, our self-esteem, which leads to self-concept issues where we start to believe these stories and we fawn or conform to other people we give power to, and they start to control our lives inappropriately. So here's what happens. So if the false expectation appears real enough, we'll go into a stress response and we'll make poor decisions by freezing, flying away, flight, running away, avoidance, fighting the wrong fight, or fawning. In other words, we conform. So how do we get out of this loop? And what's important is to understand, to get there, is that we need to talk about how these stories start to form. So here's you right here. And let's just pretend we're on a linear timeline. And this is your past. And this is your future. What happens is we will take things that happen in our past and we'll project them into our future. So let's say you have a past story and then something's happened and then you'll project into the future and you will make up a story about how it's supposed to work in the future. Think of it like, imagine you're a producer or a director, and what's happened is you have a story that you've been given and you're reading it and you say, I have to make this story come into reality in the future. And so you start casting your story. And what will happen is a director or producer is paid to do this. That's their job. But if you don't know where your story comes from, what happens is you'll cast for that story in the future and you'll say, this person is the bad guy. This person's the antagonist, or this person's going to betray this person, etc. Because everybody has to fit in that story because that's the way our brain works. Our brain works on narratives. And so out of fear, we will slot people into the system of our story to keep that story going. It happens all the time in family systems, happens all the times when you triangulate in relationships. If you've ever heard of the drama triangle, someone's the persecutor, someone's the rescuer, and someone is the victim. Everybody slots themselves into the story because it starts to make sense for us in our mind in how everything starts to roll out. And this is where we get into trouble, because if you had fear from the past, then what's going to happen is you'll project that fear in the future and again, make those choices out of a stress response. So let me give you another example and let's just keep working off our model here. Say, for example, that you are saying, all right, what happens is something bad has happened in the past and that causes fear. And it might be appropriate fear. So you say something bad is going to happen because I've been here before. And what you do is you project that, and then that becomes inappropriate fear. And you say something bad always happens. Not only will something bad could happen, or something bad might happen, and I think about it, you'll project that story and say something bad always happens. And the crazy part is we don't even know that we're doing it. Now let's continue on and figure out, how do we break out of these cycles where the stories from our past, the false expectations appearing real, tether us in preventing us from moving forward and project and make us make those poor decisions, cause us to make those poor decisions. So I'm going to teach you something that I think is a wonderful tool that everybody should use, and it's called first principles thinking. First principles. So think based upon first principles versus analogy thinking. All right. So analogy thinking, like any analogy, is when you take something to compare it with another thing, and you make an analogy between the two to understand it or to explain it, to feel comfortable about it, process the information, synthesize it, what have you. And so analogy-based thinking occurs when we take a story from our past and we compare it to what's happening in the present. And we say, this has happened in the past, therefore it's probably going to happen in the present. Or we take a story from the future and compare it, the story in our minds in the future, and compare it to what's happening in the current time, in the present, and say, this is going to happen. And quite often what happens is it leads to saying, oh, that's not going to work. We tried that before, or we always do it that way. So analogy thinking is comparing the current situation to the story in your head. And that can be a past story or the constructed story, the story that you're casting for, the story that you're expecting to happen in the future, the story in your head. Now, first principles works a little different. First principles takes a scientific approach to what's happening in the present. So it says, what do we know for sure now? What is the truth right now? And how can we reason on top of it? So first principles thinking makes you stop and say, hang on a second. I know what's happened in the past, and I know what I'm expecting for the future. But let's just ignore that for a moment. Want to acknowledge, important to acknowledge your story, but let's just pause for a moment and ask, what do we know for sure? What is certain right now? What is the truth that we know for absolute certainty? And then how can we reason on top of it? Ignoring the stories in the past. I'm going to ignore the stories in the past. I'm going to acknowledge that they're there, but I'm just going to set them aside. And they might be good signposts to help you. And like I said, fear can be very appropriate. For example, if you go and you pat a certain type of dog, or you approach the dog a certain way, but that dog bit you, well, that might be highly appropriate because it might be showing you a way that you approach dogs and what have you. But does that mean every dog is going to bite you? Well, that's a false expectation appearing real. So we stop and we say, what do we know for sure? This happens with problem solving. So when you are negotiating something or you're trying to solve a particular technical problem and everybody's telling you it never works, that's not the way that it works, or that's not the way that we do it, we've always done it this way, you're taking analogies and you're comparing the past and you're projecting in the future to the current situation. So if you stop and you say, what do I know for sure? And you break it down, and how can we reason on top of it? And that's going to require a few skills. That's going to require cognitive flexibility. Cognitive flexibility. The reason I say it requires cognitive flexibility, and this is a skill that I think people really miss out on, is being able to hold two things that seem contradictory as true in your brain at the same time. To consider the paradox, if you will. How can something be light and dark at the same time? How can something be, shine light, but then also cast a shadow, which may seem a little reductive and oversimplified. But for example, you can get stuck and say it must be dark all over the place because it's dark on our side of the planet right now. How can someone have light when we're in the dark? Oversimplification, but people can get stuck because of the false expectations appearing real and a lot of the conforming, the fawning over other people's opinions that make them say one has to be true all the time, and there cannot be two concepts existing at the exact same time. And like I said, it creates a situation where there's cognitive dissonance. It's uncomfortable, but with cognitive flexibility, you can stop and say, okay, wait a second here. The story in my head can be true. These things have happened and might happen. While at the same time, my first principles can also be true and negate the story in my head. And that can be quite uncomfortable for people who've conditioned their brains and who have these stories on automatic loops, neural pathways that make your brain pretty lazy, actually, that go right to the same conclusion, the same false expectation appearing real all the time, and say something bad is always going to happen. And therefore, I must freeze, flight, fight, or conform. And how we get into first principles thinking is we must practice cognitive flexibility and accept that there may be two diametrically opposed truths existing in our brain at the same time. And they might even negate each other, contradict each other. Doesn't make sense. They're in paradox. That's what the entire yin and yang philosophy is all about. It's about the paradox of two things existing at the exact same time. So let's go all the way back to false expectations appearing real. What do you do when you have false expectations that appear real and your story is holding you back? Well, first of all, you have to recognize and you have to say, wait a second, what is the story? What is the story? And when have I picked up this story? When have I picked up this story? How has that story affected me? And who am I in this story? Or who do I want everybody else to be in the story? And then we go backwards, or we do this cycle again, and we start to undo, and we go right back to first principles thinking. And what do I know to be true? So we have to reset. Instead of going all the way around and letting your brain get to the point where all of a sudden you're making decisions on who you are, who others should be in the story, out of a fear response, you say, wait a second, I have false expectations appearing real. What do I know to be true? And how can I reason from there? How can I reason on top of it? So that might seem a little complicated, but first start with the fear, false expectations appearing real, and then use first principles thinking. Recognize the fear and then say, okay, hang on a second. I'm going to acknowledge the story, but the story doesn't have to be true. Even though it seems true, it feels so true. It occurs to me as so true in my mind. How can I use first principles thinking and then reason on top of it? What do I know to be true, absolutely certain of right now? And how can I reason on top of it? And it really helps to bring other people in as well who will challenge you to break things down so you're not living in your story. You're not projecting your story in the future and casting that movie based on false expectations appearing real. So I hope this was helpful, and let me know if you have questions, and we can keep working on how you're going to move forward with success and fulfillment using these techniques. Talk to you soon.